In the age before maps, when mountains still chose their names, Nyxara walked the rim of the world. She was born of dusk and iron, a child claimed by no temple, carrying a voice that could wake stones. The elders said she was marked, not blessed, because her dreams arrived with consequences. When she slept, forgotten gods leaned closer. When she woke, cities shifted like chess pieces. Nyxara sought the archive of Ash, a myth whispered among sailors and widows, where truth burned without light. Her reason was simple and dangerous. She wanted to learn which fate was hers, and which could be refused. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The archive lay beneath a sea that never touched water. Nyxara had descended through echoes, guided by Ninamos, a god made thin by neglect, whose memory leaked like sand. He demanded a price, not blood, but certainty. Inside the archive, stories were stacked like bones, each labeled with a life unlived. Nyxara read of victories that poisoned love, of mercy that collapsed empires, of passion tempered into law. Menemos warned her that knowledge ripened desire, and desire sharpened loss. She answered that loss had already sharpened her, and stepped deeper, where names learned to look back. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. At the center burned the loom without hands. Threads moved by listening alone, weaving outcomes from attention. Nyxara understood then the adult truth the myths hide. Power is a conversation, not a crown. The loom asked nothing, yet required everything, because choosing one thread dimmed another. She felt love as gravity, ambition as weather, regret as a faithful animal. A rival appeared, Kale of the Salt Crown, who wanted the loom to seal his rule forever. They spoke without shouting, bargaining with futures, each sentence aging them, each silence costing years. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice. Time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The bargain broke when the old gods woke jealous. Thunder arrived like a verdict. Nyxara cut a single thread. Not the brightest, but the truest. The one that allowed endings. Kael reached for immortality and grasped repetition instead. A lesson etched in salt. Cities felt the change as patience returned to markets, and grief learned a language. Minamos smiled heavier with memory, and paid his debt by forgetting her face, preserving her freedom. Nyxara fled the archive as it collapsed into ash, carrying no prophecy, only responsibility. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. Years later, myths named her many things, none correct. Nyxara lived quietly, an adult among consequences, loving carefully, choosing slowly. When storms asked her for advice, she listened first. The world did not become gentle, but it became honest. Temples taught that endings are doors, not punishments. Some nights she dreamed of threads humming approval. Other nights she slept without visitors. That was the victory she kept. A life not owned by legend, a fate negotiated daily, and the courage to accept joy without demanding forever. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. The night listened as gods remembered old oaths, and mortals felt the weight of choice, time circling like a serpent around the fire of destiny. Long before history learned to flatter itself, there existed a city of obsidian law named Pharos, where truth was heavier than mercy. Its streets were engraved with vows, each promise carved deep enough to survive generations. The people believed permanence was virtue, and change a kind of failure. Elian served as a listener, trained to feel dishonesty before it formed language. He trusted systems more than intentions, until the morning a woman arrived, who left no echo when she walked. Her name was Illyra. She bore no sigil of god or guild, yet the air shifted as she spoke. She did not demand power or forgiveness. She requested release. A vow, sworn by her bloodline to a forgotten deity, bound her life into obedience she never chose. The elders insisted vows were immortal. Elian felt something fracture inside certainty itself. That evening, the sun set too slowly, as if delaying judgment. Elian realized myths were not stories about gods, but contracts written by fear. And for the first time, he wondered whether faith survived truth, or merely hid from it. The night listened as abandoned gods stirred uneasily, and mortals felt the pressure of choice pressing against tradition. Time tightening like a held breath before a fall. The night listened as abandoned gods stirred uneasily, and mortals felt the pressure of choice pressing against tradition. Time tightening like a held breath before a fall. The night listened as abandoned gods stirred uneasily, and mortals felt the pressure of choice pressing against tradition. Time tightening like a held breath before a fall. At dawn, Elion led Illyra beneath Pharos, past stairways worn smooth by centuries of obedience. The lower chambers were colder. Not from stone, but from accumulated restraint. This was the Hall of Binding, where vows were preserved long after belief had thinned. Some promises whispered constantly, others slept, coiled and patient.
Illyra moved without hesitation, as though memory itself parted for her. She spoke of her ancestor, a woman who had sworn eternal service during an age of famine, bargaining survival for submission.
The god accepted, then withdrew, leaving only the vow behind, feeding on descendants like a slow illness. Elion argued law. Illyra answered with consequence. She said inheritance was not consent, and endurance was not devotion. As they reached the central plinth, the god's name pulsed faintly, irritated by attention. Elion felt fear, not of punishment, but of revision. To unbind this oath would mean admitting the city had mistaken obedience for morality. The chamber trembled softly, like a body waking from a long restraint. Elion understood then that vows, when denied renewal, did not preserve order. They preserved silence. The night listened as abandoned gods drew closer, and mortals felt the strain of truth pressing against tradition. Time bending like metal tested too far. The night listened as abandoned gods drew closer, and mortals felt the strain of truth pressing against tradition. Time bending like metal tested too far. The night listened as abandoned gods drew closer, and mortals felt the strain of truth pressing against tradition. Time bending like metal tested too far. The god announced itself not with thunder, but with familiarity. Its presence settled into the chamber like an old habit returning to the body. It called itself continuance and claimed that endurance was the highest form of love. Elion felt its voice inside his thoughts, rearranging memories, softening doubt. Ilya resisted without effort, her silence sharper than prayer. Continuance accused her bloodline of ingratitude, reminding her that survival had once required surrender. Illyra replied that survival without choice was merely prolonged fear. The god offered compromise. The vow could remain lighter, quieter, nearly kind.
Ilian realized then how tyranny survived, not through cruelty, but through accommodation. He stepped forward, breaking protocol, and spoke the words no listener was trained to say.
He declared the vow expired. The chamber recoiled.
Continuance faltered, its shape blurring as belief withdrew. Power drained, not because it was struck, but because it was refused. Illyria placed her hand on the stone and felt generations exhale. The god diminished, not slain, but concluded, its purpose fulfilled and therefore finished.
Theros shook gently, as if testing new balance. Ilion understood the cost instantly. He had chosen responsibility over neutrality, adulthood over safety. The night listened, as abandoned gods recalculated their relevance, and mortals felt the pressure of freedom enter the world, heavy and irreversible. The night listened as abandoned gods recalculated their relevance, and mortals felt the pressure of freedom enter the world, heavy and irreversible. The night listened as abandoned gods recalculated their relevance, and mortals felt the pressure of freedom enter the world, heavy and irreversible. When the chamber stilled, Theros did not collapse as the elders had warned. Instead, it hesitated, like a creature learning a new posture.
Above ground, bells rang without being touched, announcing nothing and everything. News of the broken vow spread quickly, distorted by fear and hope in equal measure.
The council summoned Elian and stripped him of his title, claiming neutrality had been violated. Ilian accepted without protest. Authority, he understood now, was a tool, not an identity. Illyria prepared to leave the city before gratitude could harden into expectation. Her shadow had returned fully, imperfect but loyal. She told Ilian she had not come to save Theros, only to stop it from mistaking endurance for virtue. As she departed, the streets felt wider, less certain, more alive. In the Hall of Binding, unused vows began to crack, their whispers fading into dust. Some citizens panicked, others slept for the first time without inherited dread. Ilian walked the city as an unnamed man, watching people choose their words more carefully. The guards remained silent, listening. Theros did not become kinder, but it became honest.
And honesty, Ilian thought, was a form of courage no oath could enforce. The night listened as abandoned gods weighed retreat against renewal, and mortals felt the uneasy balance of freedom settling into bone and breath.
The night listened as abandoned gods weighed retreat against renewal, and mortals felt the uneasy balance of freedom settling into bone and breath. The night listened as abandoned gods weighed retreat against renewal, and mortals felt the uneasy balance of freedom settling into bone and breath. Years later, Theros was no longer famous for its permanence, but for its pauses. Promises were spoken more slowly, renewed aloud, or allowed to end without ceremony.
Ilian lived near the outer walls, teaching the discipline of deliberate speech to those who sought it. He never reclaimed a title.
Names, he believed, were the first vows people forgot to question. Occasionally, travelers spoke of a woman with a steady shadow who moved from city to city, loosening inherited burdens and leaving before devotion could form. Ilian did not search for her. Some forces were meant to pass through, not return. The gods, fewer now, adjusted to being remembered selectively. Without constant obedience, they learned proportion. Some faded, others adapted. The world did not become gentle nor fair, but it became negotiable. Cycles once called eternal learned to end.
One evening, as the sun lowered itself without spectacle, Elian felt no regret, only weight, and the strength to carry it. He understood then that adulthood was not freedom from consequence, but consent to bear it.
The myth closed quietly, without triumph. No monument marked the change. Only people, choosing their words, knowing that what they promised would shape the world. And that ending was not betrayal, but completion. The night listened as diminished gods accepted their silence, and mortals felt the steady presence of choice settle into history like a final honest breath. The night listened as diminished gods accepted their silence, and mortals felt the steady presence of choice settle into history like a final, honest breath. The night listened as diminished gods accepted their silence, and mortals felt the steady presence of choice settle into history like a final, honest breath. In a low valley where the air moved gently, there was a lake called Aurelian. Its surface was clear, not from purity, but from patience. People lived nearby without building stories around it, which allowed the place to remain honest. Mira had settled at the water's edge years earlier, not in exile or devotion, but in quiet agreement with herself. She tended soil that responded more to attention than effort, and she learned the lake's moods without asking questions. Old myths claimed the lake was once a god who stepped down from power, choosing stillness over command. Mira never corrected or confirmed this. She understood that peace does not ask to be believed. Travelers sometimes arrived with hopes of visions or signs. The lake returned only reflections, forcing them to meet themselves. Many left unsatisfied. Mira stayed. Each evening, sky and water leaned toward one another without tension, and the valley felt held rather than watched. In that space, time did not disappear, but it loosened, allowing life to unfold without urgency or performance. One morning, Mira felt drawn closer to the lake, not by voice, but by an ease she trusted. She stepped into the water and felt no shock, only welcome. Beneath the surface, there were no prophecies, only memories, drifting like leaves that had accepted the current. She saw moments of kindness that had never been praised, grief endured without witnesses, choices made simply because they felt right. The lake did not teach or judge. It offered room. When Mira returned to shore, the world remained unchanged, and yet she felt expanded. Word spread quietly that sitting by the lake eased restless minds. People began visiting without expectation, lingering longer than planned. Disputes softened, not because they were solved, but because they lost urgency. Mira continued her days as before, gardening, repairing, resting. She understood then that peace was not something achieved, but something allowed. Years passed without announcement. Children raised near the lake learned to listen before they learned to speak. They skipped stones without needing them to sink. Travelers arrived with fewer questions and left without regret. Mira aged gently, without fear of unfinished purpose. When asked what wisdom the lake offered, she answered that listening was a form of respect. One quiet morning she did not wake. The village gathered, unsure whether to expect signs. The lake remained calm. They placed her body near the water, and the earth accepted her without resistance. That night, the stars reflected clearly, as if nothing stood between worlds. There was sorrow, but it did not sharpen into pain. The lake did not stir. If a god slept beneath it, rest had become its truest expression. Life continued without disruption. Mira's garden grew freely, untended yet generous. People spoke of her less often, not from forgetting, but from peace. The lake remained unchanged, and the village became known not for wonders, but for calm. No shrine was built, no ritual demanded. Travelers who stayed a while found themselves breathing more slowly, thinking less harshly. Suffering still arrived, but it did not dominate. Even distant gods seemed quieter, as if aware that nothing here needed correction. The valley offered no answers, only space, and that proved sufficient. Harmony endured not because it was guarded, but because no one tried to possess it. Long after names lost importance, Aurelian remained. No one claimed it, no one defended it. Children played nearby, adults paused, elders rested. Stories mentioned the lake briefly, then moved on. Peace did not insist on memory. It endured because it was unremarkable and unowned. Beneath the water, if a god still slept, it dreamed nothing at all. The valley remained open, and the world, passing through, learned that not everything sacred must speak, shine, or endure loudly. Some things exist best when left alone. At the edge of a quiet coast stood a lighthouse that no longer appeared on maps. Ships had learned other routes, and storms rarely came this way anymore. The tower remained, not abandoned, but unneeded. Ilera lived there alone, rising with the dim light of early morning and sleeping when the night felt complete. She kept no clock. Time arrived gently, like the tide. The sea below the cliffs moved in wide, unhurried motions, never loud, never demanding. Elara tended the lighthouse as one tends memory, carefully and without expectation. She cleaned the glass, trimmed the wick, and kept the door from creaking, though few visitors ever came. She believed places deserved attention even after their purpose had passed. In the evenings, she walked along the shore, letting cool water touch her ankles, listening to waves dissolve their thoughts against the sand. The world felt slower here, not empty, but settled. As night deepened, the lighthouse glowed softly, not to warn or guide, but simply to exist. The nights along the coast carried a particular stillness. Wind moved gently, careful not to disturb the water. Ilara often sat outside after dusk, wrapped in a worn shawl, watching the horizon blur into darkness. She thought of nothing specific. The sea seemed to approve of this. Occasionally, travelers arrived by accident, having followed the wrong road, or sought a place without noise. Ilara welcomed them quietly, offering warm food and low light. She asked no questions. Most slept deeply for the first time in months. In the morning, they spoke softly, as if words themselves needed rest. No one stayed long. The lighthouse did not invite attachment. It offered pause. Ilara never explained this. She believed peace worked best when unnamed. After visitors left, she returned to her routines, grateful for the silence that followed, like a long breath finally released. Seasons change without ceremony? The sea cooled, warmed, and cooled again. Ilera aged slowly, her movements careful but unstrained. She found comfort in repetition that did not demand progress. Some nights, she dreamed of nothing at all, waking rested and uncurious. The lighthouse lamp grew dimmer over time, though Ilara continued lighting it at dusk. One evening, she noticed it glowed even before she touched it, faint but steady. She felt no alarm. That night, she lay down earlier than usual, listening to waves settle into rhythm. Sleep arrived gently, without images, without memory. Outside, the sea remained calm. The lighthouse stood watch alone, its light breathing quietly into the dark, needing no keeper, yet grateful for having had one. When morning came, Ilara did not rise. the sea knew this before the sun did. The light continued glowing until daylight softened it away. Days passed. The lighthouse remained untouched. Birds nested near the roof. Grass thickened along the path. Travelers who passed nearby felt compelled to slow, though they could not explain why. Some rested at the base of the tower, closing their eyes briefly before continuing on. No one felt loss. The place did not ask for grief. It offered rest instead. The sea held its rhythm, unchanged. Whatever Elara had been, she had become part of the quiet, woven into the air and stone without effort. Years later, the lighthouse still stood, no longer marked, no longer maintained, yet peaceful. The coast remained calm. Children played nearby without shouting. Adults paused there without planning to. At night, a faint glow sometimes appeared, not bright enough to guide ships, but enough to soften darkness. No stories explained it. None were needed. The sea continued its patient movement, carrying no urgency. The world passed by, rested briefly, and moved on. Sleep came easily near the tower, deep and untroubled. Whatever watched over the coast did so without intention, content to exist quietly. And in that stillness, night felt safe enough to stay a while longer. Far from busy roads and restless towns, there was a plain where the earth lay open and patient beneath the sky. No fences divided it, no signs claimed it. Grass grew in long, soft waves, bending easily to the wind and returning upright without complaint. At the center of this plain stood a solitary house made of pale wood, weathered by time, but never neglected. It belonged to a man named Aaron, though names mattered little here. Aaron lived without urgency. He woke when light reached the window, not when time demanded it. Each morning he stepped outside barefoot, feeling the ground remind him where he was. The air carried no sharp smells, only the clean presence of grass and distant rain. He brewed tea slowly, letting steam rise and disappear without watching it too closely. Silence was never empty in this place. It rested gently, like a companion who did not need conversation. The sky above the plain seemed wider than elsewhere. Clouds moved without direction, changing shape simply because they could. Aaron often watched them from the porch, not searching for meaning, only allowing his thoughts to loosen and drift. He believed the land remembered footsteps, not to hold them, but to let them fade. As evening arrived, colors softened rather than darkened. The sun lowered itself carefully, leaving warmth behind. Iron lit a small lamp inside the house, its glow steady and calm. Outside, insects began their quiet rhythms, and the wind settled into a slow breath. Night did not fall here. It arrived gently, as if invited, and the plain rested beneath it without resistance. Morning returned without announcement. Light spread across the plain in a thin, patient layer, touching grass, wood, and stone equally. Aaron woke naturally, not from sleep ending, but from rest completing itself. He lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe as wood warmed and settled. There was comfort in knowing nothing waited for him, except the day itself. Outside, dew clung to the grass, turning the plain into a quiet field of small reflections. Iran stepped out carefully, not wanting to disturb the balance too quickly. He walked without destination, following the gentle curves of the land. The earth felt cool and firm beneath his feet, grounding him in a way thought never could. He believed the body understood peace before the mind learned its name. As the sun rose higher, birds crossed the sky in loose patterns, never hurried, never late. Their calls were soft,
Not warnings or signals, just acknowledgements of presence.
Aaron paused often, not from tiredness, but from appreciation. He had learned that movement did not need to lead somewhere to be meaningful.
Later, he returned to the house and prepared a simple meal. He ate slowly, tasting without judgment, letting hunger fade naturally. There were no mirrors inside the house, only windows. Aaron preferred reflection that changed with the day. He spent the afternoon mending small things, a loose hinge, a worn handle, tasks that asked for attention but not thought. As evening approached again, the plane shifted color, greens deepening, shadows lengthening without threat. The air cooled slightly, inviting rest rather than sleep. Aaron sat outside as night approached, feeling time widen instead of pass. When darkness finally settled, it felt earned, like the final note of a long, gentle song. The third night arrived with a deeper quiet, the kind that feels layered rather than empty. Stars appeared slowly, one by one, as if the sky were remembering where to place them. Aaron lay awake for a while, not from restlessness, but from a gentle awareness of being present. The house held warmth from the day, releasing it gradually, like a long exhale. Sometime before dawn, rain came. It was light and patient, falling straight down without wind. The sound moved across the roof and into the plain, stitching earth and sky together. Aaron listened without opening his eyes, allowing the rhythm to carry him back into sleep. When he woke again, the air felt washed and open. The plain looked renewed, though nothing had changed. Drops rested on grass tips, reflecting pale light. Aaron walked farther than usual that morning, following the soft rise of land until the house became small behind him. From there, the world felt wide and unclaimed. He stood still for a long time, feeling neither large nor small, only correctly placed. He remembered arriving here long ago, though the memory had softened at the edges. He had not come seeking escape or answers. He had come because the land had felt quiet enough to listen. Over time, listening had become living. Thoughts no longer pressed for conclusions. Feelings passed through without leaving weight.
In the afternoon, clouds gathered but brought no storm. Their shadows drifted across the plain, cooling the ground briefly before moving on.
Aaron returned home as evening approached, not from need, but from familiarity. Inside, the lamp waited unlit. He touched it once, then left it dark, choosing starlight instead. That night, sleep arrived without images or dreams. It wrapped gently around him, unbroken and deep. Outside, the plain rested fully, holding the quiet carefully, as if it understood that peace, once found, should not be disturbed. Time moved differently after the rain, not faster or slower, but smoother. Days followed one another, without sharp edges. Aaron noticed this not as a change, but as a release. He no longer measured mornings by light alone, but by how his body felt when it chose to rise. Some days began early, others waited. The plain accepted both without preference. Small changes appeared quietly. New grass pushed through where the rain had softened the soil. Insects returned in gentle numbers, never overwhelming. At night, their sounds blended into the wind, creating a low, steady presence that filled the space between thoughts. Aaron spent more time outside now, sitting directly on the earth, feeling its slow warmth leave as evening cooled. He began speaking aloud occasionally, not to anyone, but to keep his voice familiar. The words were simple, often unfinished. The land did not answer, yet it seemed to listen. He believed listening did not require response, only attention. This belief settled into him like a second breath. One afternoon, he found himself standing far from the house, near the edge of the plain where grass thinned and stones appeared. From there, the land looked endless, not in distance, but in continuity. Nothing marked where it began or ended. The thought brought no fear.
Boundaries, he realized, were useful only when something needed protection. As dusk approached, the sky softened into muted colors, neither bright nor dark.
Iran walked home slowly, every step unhurried. He lit the lamp that night, not because he needed light, but because warmth felt appropriate. Inside the house, shadows moved gently along the walls, familiar and calm. When sleep came, it did not erase the day. It carried it forward, smoothly, without interruption. The plain outside remained quiet, holding the stillness carefully, as if aware that something fragile and valuable was being allowed to continue undisturbed. The final days arrived without announcing themselves. Nothing marked them as different, and that was how they were meant to be. Iran continued his routines, though they felt less like habits and more like gentle agreements with the day. He noticed that effort had faded from his movements. Everything happened with the ease of familiarity, as if the plain itself guided him. One morning, he did not step outside immediately.
He sat by the window, watching light stretch across the grass, noticing how the land accepted it without reaction. There was no sense of ending, only completion.
His breath felt deep and unhurried. He understood then that peace was not something he had reached, but something that had slowly reached him. Later, he walked farther than usual, standing once more where the house became small behind him. The wind passed gently, touching his clothes without insistence. He felt no desire to hold the moment. Presence was enough. When he returned, the house welcomed him quietly, wood creaking softly, as if recognizing his steps. That evening, the lamp remained unlit.
Moonlight filled the room instead, pale and steady. Iran lay down earlier than usual, not from tiredness, but from readiness.
Sleep came slowly, layering itself carefully, deeper than before. Outside, the plain held its silence, unchanged and patient. When morning arrived, the house stood empty. The plain showed no sign of disturbance. Grass bent and rose again. Wind moved freely. Time continued without pause. Somewhere within the quiet, the sense of Iran remained, not as memory, but as balance. The land did not mourn. It rested. And in that rest, everything felt exactly as it should be. As the story slowly fades, there is no need to hold on to its images. They can rest now, just as you can. What remains is a quiet space, open and unhurried, where nothing needs to happen next. There is nothing you need to fix right now. Nothing you need to solve. This moment is allowed to be exactly as it is. If your body feels restless, that is okay. If your mind feels busy, that is okay too. You're not doing this wrong. You might notice your breathing, or you might not. Either way is fine. Breath has its own rhythm, and it does not need guidance to continue. Perhaps there is a surface beneath you. A bed, a chair, the floor. You do not need to focus on it, only to let it be there, quietly supporting you. Even support that goes unnoticed is still support. Thoughts may come and go. Some may feel repetitive, some unfinished. There is no need to follow them or push them away. They can pass like distant sounds, existing without needing attention. If you notice tension somewhere, shoulders, jaw, stomach, there is no need to release it. Often, tension softens on its own when it no longer has to be corrected. Time does not need to move forward right now. Nothing important depends on this moment doing anything special. Rest does not require effort. You may feel moments of calm mixed with moments of unease. This is not a setback. The nervous system often settles gradually, in waves, not all at once. If sleep arrives, it arrives naturally. If it doesn't, quiet wakefulness is still a form of rest. Your body understands the difference between danger and safety, and right now, it is allowed to learn safety again. There is no finish line here, no outcome to reach. Just a gentle space where nothing is demanded of you. And in that space, even without trying, the mind often becomes a little quieter, the body a little heavier, and rest begins to feel possible again. You are allowed to remain here as long as you wish.